Okay. All right, welcome to this most recent episode of the Akkad and Coco Report. Today, we are super lucky to have Dr. Eric Weinhandel here. He's here to talk about a really interesting retraction that he was a part of. Eric, tell us a little bit about yourself first.
Oh, sure. So, Eric Weinhandel, I'm an epidemiologist. My PhD is in epidemiology, and then I have a master's degree in biostatistics from beforehand. Had gone through both of those programs at the University of Minnesota in the School of Public Health. I'm a lifelong Minnesotan, as you can tell pretty readily from my accent. I guess that as far as clinical applications go, the twist on me is that I was a math major as an undergraduate. Between my junior and senior years of college, I did an internship in a research group that was led by a nephrologist. So it was quantitative database-driven research, not clinical research or lab-based. And so that was my first introduction to the field of end-stage renal disease dialysis. Really had minimal biology training as an undergrad. So I fell into the field completely by accident, and it has become my adult career. So, I would say that over time, particularly as the field has expanded to more epi research in pre-dialysis chronic kidney disease, and then AKI more recently in the last 10 years, certainly the field has expanded. My topics have expanded. I would say that 80% of the work I do is in dialysis. And then, maybe 10% in transplant epi and another 10% in late-stage chronic kidney disease.
Fascinating. And how did you? So walk me through after you finished your doctorate. So you have a doctorate in epidemiology. So
yeah,
right?
That's
okay.
Right.
So after you finished that, what did you do next?
So as it happened, mostly by coincidence, I had been working at a research group, the same one that I just described, that's at Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis. It's a large safety net hospital in downtown Minneapolis, operated by the county. Research group was there, and I finished my PhD around 2015. I had 3 kids during the time, my wife and I, 3 kids during my PhD, so it took a little bit longer to get the dissertation done than a normal human being would, but so goes. By the time I got my degree done, I had actually been working for about 5.5 years with a small company based in Massachusetts that was acting as a research sponsor, commercially sponsored research, and the company was called Next Stage Medical. Next Stage was created in the early 2000s, and in 2004 had FDA clearance for a home hemodialysis machine. That's called the Next Stage System 1, small machine. And it's novel relative to other hemodialysis equipment because it plugs into a regular outlet in your home rather than sort of outlet like a washing machine or a dryer plugs into. And then in addition, it takes tap water as a supply, uses the deionization process rather than a reverse osmosis system to purify the water, and then mixes it with a solution to create dialysate. So, at the time of like 2003, home hemodialysis had basically bottomed out in the United States. There were all of about 1,500 patients left doing the modality, which at that time would amount to well under 1% of the population on dialysis. Next Stage comes along in 2004 and the therapy begins to grow. And so 2015, I decided I was going to jump the ship. I had become pretty passionate about home hemodialysis as a therapy. And the clinical advantages it offers patients and their families. And I thought, this is a little non-traditional to finish your PhD and then go from a research group to industry, but I thought I'll do it. It gave me an opportunity to really focus on the therapy and supporting and building the evidence base around it. So that's where I was between 2015, 2019. Now, in the course of all of this, Fresenius Medical Care, which is a large international provider of dialysis products and services, actually had reached an agreement with Next Stage in 2017 to merge. It's called a merger. Of course, Fresenius is giant and Next Stage is very small, so it's a merger in principle. And then that took quite a while. And that was a classic vertical merger. FTC took about 18 months actually to review. And when it all came down to it, the commissioners voted 3-2 to approve the merger. And so it cleared in February 2020. And then for the last year there, between March and the very end of April of this year, I worked at Fresenius Medical Care in their medical office doing epi biostat work. But by virtue of Minnesota residency, 4 kids, a lot of things going on in my life, I decided to actually make a recent switch back to the hospital in Minneapolis. So that's where I'm at the last few weeks.
So really, really, really interesting. So what, you came up because of this paper in JAMA.
Mm-hmm.
Is a paper that looked at the relationship between dialysis facility ownership and access to kidney transplantation. Um, I remember the initial study coming out because it was kind of a little bit of a whack at
Yep.
at you know at
My employer at the time, among others.
right, exactly. So the idea was that if you were a private uh, uh, group that was doing dialysis, that you were perhaps less likely to get folks or move folks along to
Mm-hmm.
a transplant, because then once the patient's gone, they've kind of lost business. So it's somewhat of a provocative hypothesis, and
Yeah.
so how did can you walk us through the original paper? And
Oh, sure. So yeah, the paper was published around September 10th or so last year. I had no idea that it was coming. It certainly wasn't part of the review process, nor I had heard any chatter in the community about such a paper coming. Um, so, I read it, and at first glance, the first time you read a paper, you sort of try and integrate on the fly, like, how does this dovetail with existing evidence? And definitely there's been a lot of observational studies done over the last, 15, 20 years of for-profit versus not-for-profit dialysis facilities, and how that profit status correlates with any number of outcomes. Definitely death and hospitalization have been tracked. Some of the more, prototypical clinical quality measures in dialysis have been tracked. And then transplant. Transplant has not been received as much attention in this domain. There was a paper that was published maybe 4 or 5 years ago that had looked at waitlisting, waitlist registration as an outcome. And it had suggested that there was potentially about 10 to 15% lower rate of waitlisting in patients dialyzing in for-profit facilities. So there certainly was a precedent in the literature for the notion of an association that would be unfavorable to for-profit facilities. I don't recall any papers that have ever looked at kidney transplant incidence itself, and certainly none that had distinguished between living and deceased donor donation. But, so I read the paper, and of course the association was in the same direction. So you think, all right, this is possible. And then I looked back at it. It was later that evening. And I thought, the part that's odd about this paper is the 2 things. One is that the associations, the hazard ratios, were really large. We're talking about 50, 60, 70% lower rates of waitlisting and transplantation in for-profit facilities. And, when you get to associations that big, it starts to raise the question of just face validity is a little bit dubious here. I mean, how can we have associations quite that large? It's the sort of thing that if it were true, somebody would have noticed it without doing a study. And then the second thing was just that when you take a look at the very first table and figure in the paper, and in particular the flow chart, as well as the event counts. And by event counts, I'm specifically referring to the number of patients out of the whole cohort that were actually waitlisted, and the total number of people who received a transplant during follow-up. The numbers seemed really low, implausibly low. So this study cohort had included all incident dialysis patients in the United States between 2000 and 2015, if I recall right. Sometimes I forget if it's 15 or 16, but anyway, 15 to 16 years of incident patients. Number of new dialysis starts in the country has increased over time, but it's been running about 120,000, 125,000 per year for the last number of years. So you're dealing with a lot of patients, and we all know what the transplant rate is in the dialysis population. It's about 4 events per 100 patient years. So it's not too difficult to ballpark what the event count should be. And so when you see a number that doesn't match up, you think, well, where did the events go? And the associations are a little too big to be believable. So something's going on here. So that's essentially what started the journey, a suspicion that something was awry.
So you mentioned, it's interesting, you mentioned initially that it was plausible to you that this could be the case because it's been
Mm-hmm.
reported. Why do you think that is? Why is there this?
Yeah. So the thing about thinking about profit status in dialysis facilities is that it has evolved. And so, I'm going to reflexively talk about where we're at and say the 2010s. My knowledge of 2000 and 2005 has faded a little bit, but over time, for-profit facilities have grown as a percentage of all the pie, and not-for-profit facilities have diminished. Today, where we're at, we're probably at about 85 to 90% of dialysis facilities are for-profit. Okay, so that only leaves 10 to 15% that are not-for-profit. And you have to think about who those characters are then that are in that not-for-profit piece still. All right, there's a relatively sizable chain called DCI, it's Dialysis Clinic Incorporated. They're based in Tennessee, and they have a pretty good presence around the southeast and the midsection of the country. It's about 250 out of the nation's 7,000 dialysis facilities. So that by itself is the single biggest piece. Second biggest piece is a smaller chain called Satellite Healthcare that's based in California, heavy presence in Northern California, along with the smaller presence in Southern California. That's important to note because California has a very different transplant profile than other states. A lot of wait listing, pretty high transplant rate. Difficult to adjust for when you start doing covariate adjustments. It's just geographically favorable. And then after that, it really fragments into a lot of really small chains. But in particular, what's left in that leftover piece beyond DCI and satellite is what are called hospital-based dialysis facilities. And those are dialysis facilities that truly are outpatient facilities, just like a Fresenius or DaVita unit, but they're operated by hospital networks. And the important thing, which really I think fits my hypothesis at least, is that those hospital-based dialysis facilities have the ability to integrate the nephrology care that happens on the dialysis silo and the nephrology care that happens in the transplant silo, because everybody's on the same page. It's not like the difference between outpatient dialysis in a company like Fresenius or DaVita that's outside of a hospital campus, and then the patient has to go to a transplant center in a hospital to work out for a transplant and receive care. So you're integrating care better. And I think that that's probably a big chunk of why not-for-profit facilities probably appear to have higher transplant rates.
I see. So it's more the synergy that exists, perhaps, in.
That's my hypothesis.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I'll point out that this whole not-for-profit profit association is a little murky because, at least to me or to many folks, it's a little, shall we say, what's a polite way of saying it? Certainly, large not-for-profit hospitals certainly seem to act quite like for-profit.
I grew up in southern Minnesota, just a few miles from the Mayo Clinic. I've watched it grow from a tiny, pretty small hospital, so to speak, in Rochester. When I was a young kid, everybody in the area went to it for acute care, to this huge international operation. And, it generates an incredible amount of operating income. It's not to say that there's anything that I have anything negative to say about the institution, but it's not for profit. At the same time, it literally has operating income from real estate trusts. I mean,
right.
It's a murky classification.
Right. So again, you pointed out, just coming back to the paper and what you noticed, you did notice the hazard ratios, correct? Mm-hmm. But the bigger thing you said you noticed were the events. And again, this is why, it's so hard when you critically analyze papers. It's really, really hard for folks that don't have domain expertise to analyze it, right? And so to me, I'm sure, I don't know if I even read the paper, but even if I had read the paper originally when it came out, none of this would have jumped out at me. So you noticed the big thing you noticed was the number of events, right? Yep. So how many, and specifically it was the number of patients in 17 years, right? Is that?
Yeah, no, basically that's right. So everybody was followed from their first day of dialysis. There were a few exclusion criteria. One of the notable ones was that if you were actually waitlisted before starting dialysis, you weren't part of this cohort. So these were basically patients who were completely naive to the transplant registration workup process. They start dialysis and they're being followed until first event is either waitlisting, or in the case of, say, a person who receives a living donation, they may not be waitlisted previously. But that notion of counting time until initial waitlisting, that's a number that, when you think about percentage of patients who get there, denominator in this study after the exclusion criteria were applied was something like 1.5 million patients. That should generate around 250,000 initial wait lists over the course of this follow-up period. And I believe that the study itself recorded in one of its tables around 120,000 rather than 230 to 250,000. So pretty big deviation from what I would have expected.
Yeah. So, right. So there were 1.9 million incident end-stage kidney disease patients in 17 years. They excluded 250,000 patients for lack of dialysis facility information, which was, a flaw in the study, but that is what it is. So that leaves, that's what you're saying, 1.5 million dialysis patients with no history of being waitlisted. They then kind of followed these folks out, and that generates what they said was 121,000 first waitlist events, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
23,000 transplants out of that group, 42,000 deceased donor transplants. Sorry, 23,000 living donor transplants, 49,000 deceased donor transplants. And these counts, so a guy like you that's been buried in this stuff and has been doing this for, a decade, right? You were like, whoa, this is vastly abnormal. So what?
Yeah.
So walk us through from there. So what?
Right. So
you started to say that you would expect far more waitlist events. That there are far more waitlist events for that amount of time. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So the study materials are something called the United States Renal Data System database. It's USRDS is the acronym. This is a contract through the NIDDK, and for the sake of disclosure, it's a contract that my current employer actually holds. So essentially, the USRDS is a registry of end-stage renal disease in the United States. Many high-income countries have registries. Many middle-income countries have registries. Canada has one. Australia, New Zealand has one. England has one. There is a sort of loose connection of European registries that form a pan-continental registry as well. Anyway, this registry has existed in the United States since the late 1980s. Its backbone is basically Medicare data. So to give you a quick aside, if a patient presents with end-stage renal disease, they are entitled to Medicare regardless of age. They do have to satisfy the working quarters criterion, 20 working quarters, but otherwise they're entitled to Medicare. Now, some people come in with commercial insurance, and an increasingly large share come in with Medicare Advantage. But if you don't come in with anything, there are some different pathways and delays to the point that you get Medicare for the first day, but basically the first day of the fourth calendar month, you're guaranteed to be in. So Medicare has an excellent count of the denominator of registered ESRD cases. They know who has ESRD, and they know who's alive, and they know death notification forms because they mandate those for all patients too, regardless of whether they're Medicare enrolled or not. So this USRDS database basically is this sort of backbone of the registry. There are claims data from fee-for-service involved. There are some newer instruments. One's called Crown Web, which is basically it's a monthly collection of biochemical data and other treatment parameters that all dialysis providers must report for all patients, regardless of payer. And then in addition, the registry itself actually borrows data from the solid organ transplant registry, which is an entirely different program because that's one is administered by HRSA rather than NIH and NIDDK. But that registry, called the SRTR, Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients, collects data on all transplant waitlisting events, transplant events, graft failure events. And so all of those data are actually for kidney transplant events transferred over to USRDS and built into the registry as well. So that database, anyone can access. It's actually free of charge. You have to have an IRB approval, complete a data use agreement, and you can request any number of data sets. I happen to have several DUAs active with USRDS data, and so I thought, I've got a suspicion that this study isn't quite right. Let's try it out. So I just went right into the data and, tried to replicate the basic parts of it. Now, working to my advantage, if you look closely at the tables in the paper, is that when they actually applied risk adjustment, and moved from crude models to, richly adjusted models, the hazard ratios didn't really change that much. So I thought to myself, wow, that kind of eliminates the need for me to have to go through the really arduous work, which would be constructing all the covariates. All I have to do is basically build the cohort, identify the time to event variables, and see what kind of associations I get. And are my crude numbers going to match theirs or not? I don't need to worry too much about doing risk adjustment. So that's where it started. And long story short, within about 48, 72 hours, I don't know, it was pretty clear that I wasn't getting the same numbers. I wasn't getting the same numbers for events, and I definitely wasn't getting the same number for the hazard ratios. So, my suspicions at this point are confirmed.
So it makes, again, their numbers were 121,000 of 1.5 million would be waitlisted. Most initial waitlisting activity occurs during those first 2 years after dialysis initiation, and from UNOS data that between 2000 and 2016, the U.S. had 14 to 19,000 kidney transplants per year, and there's some second and third kidney transplants as well. But during that 17-year period of time, there were 280,000 transplants, right?
Right.
The study only had 70,000 transplants, and so when you went about trying to recreate that, this is when you came up with some very, very different event rates.
Yeah, that's right. Definitely that gap between 280 and 70, there are some real reasons for that are totally legitimate. The 280 comes from all the transplants that occurred within the era. The study includes only the patients between 2000 and 2016 who actually initiated dialysis. So you can imagine you could have a patient who receives transplant in 2004, they actually initiated dialysis in 1996. So that transplant wouldn't ever have been a part of this cohort. So, the gap between 280 and 70,000 is not so much, it's not exclusively due to any kind of study errors or any questions about the study. It's more so a function of the design. But It definitely is the case that, if you replicate the denominator as constructed in this study, you should be seeing somewhere in the neighborhood of about, I think I recall, 135, 140,000 transplants, rather than the 70,000 that were in the study.
Right, exactly. So what you did when you did this September 11th, you got out of the 1.7 million, you using the same time period, basically, not the same data set, but the same time period. You got 1.7 million patients. You got of those 1.7 million patients who were dialysis patients, that generated for you 250,000 initial waitlist events, as compared to what they got, which was 121,000 waitlist events, right?
Yep.
And as you said, 130,000 total transplants, whereas they got 70,000 total transplants. So numbers that are wildly different.
Pretty different, yeah.
So you're pretty convinced now, because now you've kind of proved what seemed to be intuitively fairly obvious to you when you looked at it, that numbers were off by a good bit. Can we take a brief segue here before we go on in terms of what happened next? Now, this is a peer-reviewed paper in JAMA. What isn't this the exact thing that peer review is for, to catch things like this?
Yeah. So there are different ways to look at this. I think that there is a political angle, and I think that anybody would be naive if they denied that. Definitely the segment of the dialysis provision industry that is for profit is definitely open for criticism. Both DaVita and Fresenius, as well as many other smaller providers, have been involved in litigation with the federal government at various points. I would certainly characterize the dialysis population as socioeconomically relatively deprived and low, and so it's an area in which you worry about the vulnerability of the patient population for sure. So when you see a result like this, I'm just surmising. if you see a result like this and you're at a journal, you're thinking, wow, this is really a big story. And so, I don't know how that influences the rigor of a review, but there is a certain confirmation bias that probably goes with a result like this when you first see it. Now, setting that aside, then you get into scientific topics. It's a giant registry, and it's a registry that is capable of producing all sorts of wildly confounded results. It's capable of leading you completely astray if you don't know what you're doing. It's got a lot of complexity. It's evolved over time. I think the challenge is that I don't know any way around this. When you're inviting reviewers to this paper, a paper like this that uses USRDS data, that uses Medicare claims, I think you have to invite reviewers who know the data sets. And I don't know if that happened or not. My suspicion is that it didn't. But even if you invite someone who, say, has a publication or two, even in high impact nephrology journals that used the same data set, use USRDS, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that they would be able to diagnose this level of detail. I mean, I worked at the office that held the USRDS Coordinating Center contract between 2000 and 2014. So I was part of building the registry database year after year, not just an end user of it.
Right. Boy. We'll come back to this, but really, really outstanding that you were able to pick it up. But so coming back, so you found this, and now you're pretty convinced that there's a significant error. What did you do next?
All right. Well, I mean, to make this clear, I read the paper and I went on this little journey on my own. I know it would be very intuitive to assume that my employer wanted me to do this. Paper obviously wasn't friendly to the interests of any for-profit dialysis provider, but honestly, my employer really had very little idea other than, me saying that I'm taking a look at this paper and doing the analysis. It wasn't like anybody commanded me to do this. But nonetheless, I've got an inherent conflict of interest. I'm employed by a for-profit dialysis provider, and I've got this result, and I think it's wrong. My interest is in setting the scientific record straight, correcting an error if there is one. I can't say that I was particularly invested in what it meant for corporate reputations and all that kind of stuff, but I knew that if I just throw this out there to the authors, to the journal, it's pretty easy to dismiss me. I mean, I was on this side too before I worked at Next Stage in Fresenius. And if an industry representative approached me and said, your study is all messed up, I'd be like, well, okay, then that's what I expect you to say. So it was challenging. I certainly had plenty of mentors who had been around. One of the nephrologists that, is largely responsible for training me, I met him when I was 21. He gives me tons of good advice. And so, I asked around and I said, well, you could write a letter to the editor. That'd be the traditional thing to do. But JAMA's letter to the editor policy says no unpublished data. So you're boxed in a little bit because you can't put speculative data in from your own little toy analysis into a letter to the editor. So I knew that one of the associate editors of JAMA is a nephrologist. And I've got a relationship with him from past collaborations. And so I thought, well, I'll send him an email. And I asked him, when I sent him the initial email, I said, I've got a conflict of interest, but I've looked at these data and I've done my own analysis, and I'm pretty confident that these are flawed. And I had sent him a very, very preliminary slide deck of what I had thought, what I generated from the analysis, and said, what do you think I should do in my position? And I said, I'm asking you as a person who, sure, you're an associate editor, but I'm not asking you your official capacity as an associate editor. I just want your perspective on how to proceed. And so he responded to me and, said, I think that you should reach out to the authors. They're friendly people. And, they'd probably be happy to talk to you and listen to what you've discovered. And I thought, okay, that's fine. I actually knew some of the co-authors on the paper. The senior author on the paper is a person that I certainly have mutual acquaintances with, other epidemiologists and ESRD transplant and stuff. We certainly have as common friends. I didn't know her particularly well, but I knew some of the middle authors on the paper from other kinds of projects and collaborations. So anyway, I sat on that advice for a few days, didn't do anything. And then this associate editor, JAMA, emailed me several days later, and he says, I reached out to the authors myself, and I told them that you'd like to talk to them. And so they'd be happy to talk to you, send her an email, and then see what happens. And so I did that. I followed through, total cold call, but essentially wrote a long email to the senior author of the paper, introduced myself, disclosed my inherent conflict of interest, and laid out where I thought, I laid out the fact that there was a discrepancy. At this point, it's pretty difficult for me to understand what why the discrepancy has existed. I mean, you can see the numbers are not the same, but I'm not at the point yet in this first email where I've diagnosed what's going on.
So you emailed them, and the response you got was what?
Well, positive. I mean, super friendly, and I give credit to the senior author. She's the only person that I corresponded with during the course of all of this, which went on for 3-4 weeks. She was very friendly, very gracious, and so I give her all the credit. I'm sure, in hindsight, this was a challenging situation to manage, but naturally, like any human being, I think you're going to want to, resort to defend your work. And I think it's fair to say that she felt confident in her results initially, had a team of people who had, developed code, checked numbers over and over. I mean, a lot of times you worry about, did you transcribe numbers from your statistical software over to the paper correctly? Like, that's the error, rather than, the code or data processing. So, we recognized that we had different numbers, and she was resolved to trying to understand why the numbers were different, without initially, of course, naturally admitting that, of course, that there is necessarily a problem. She wouldn't have reason to believe that there is one at that point. Could be that I made the mistake.
It's interesting because it doesn't take that much to figure out that it doesn't take that much to figure out that the number of events are vastly off, right? I mean, that doesn't take crunching code to figure out where the mistake is.
Right.
Clearly, upfront, the error that is pretty easy to see is that there's way more transplants happening over that time course.
Yeah.
Right. But anyhow, but again, this
agree with you, and yeah.
This gets back to your point about end users of databases, right? And folks that are kind of, have deep knowledge of the actual data. Folks that are to her, or the senior author on a paper in JAMA, and to that team, that's what she had this database. She crunched the numbers. She had this hypothesis, crunched the numbers, came out with a bunch of stuff, and to her, none of that seems abnormal. But anyway, regardless, she feels confident that hey, I don't know why this discrepancy is happening. She still thinks maybe it's something you did. You're some an epidemiologist that works for a for-profit, and who knows? You're some random epidemiologist.
Yeah, totally.
Maybe you made the mistake. So the next thing that happens is she puts her code up on GitHub.
Yeah, she had said she was going to do that, and I'm sure she was planning on doing it. Now, I was pretty obsessed with this little problem at this point in time. So she tells me that she's going to put the code on GitHub. I waited a few days, and I thought, I hadn't received an email, and so I thought, GitHub is searchable. It's basically all available to the public unless you lock stuff down that you upload to the website yourself. I said, I should be able to figure this out. How many people are uploading code that somehow is analyzing kidney transplants and USRDS? And so sure enough, I was actually, I had dropped my kids off at church, and I was sitting there in the parking lot with my computer on Wednesday night. And within about 10-15 minutes, I had found the code. So
they had uploaded the code.
They had uploaded the code, or they had it there all along. And maybe it was just that they hadn't informed me yet. But anyway, I found it. And so I started taking a look at it. And, anytime you look at anybody else's code, it's always challenging to work through. No matter how clean or well documented it is, it still is somebody else's logic. And so you got to fight through it. Now, the data processing was in SAS. SAS is the USRDS data sets are distributed in SAS data set format. So that's the starting point for most people. So it was easy to understand the logic of the code. But at this point, I'm still kind of flying blind, not quite sure where the error has occurred. I don't necessarily have a sense of like, is it early on in data processing, cohort construction? Is it later on when you get to the time to event data variable construction, or is it the Cox model itself? So I'm kind of open-minded at this point and sort of parsing all the pieces at the same time. Now, it was pretty clear to me after not too long that the statistical modeling wasn't the issue. I didn't need to spend any time looking at that stuff. It wasn't like there was a 0-1 variable that was flipped or anything. But then I started looking very early on at the construction of the cohorts, and that's kind of where my curiosity got piqued. Now, one of the things I didn't mention earlier is that's kind of odd about the study results in JAMA is that the mix of for-profit to not-for-profit patients, as they're attributed to dialysis facilities, didn't look quite right to me. It actually looked like there were far too many not-for-profit patients. And like I said, back in 2000, there were more not-for-profit facilities in this country than there are in 2020 or there were in 2015. But the mix of for-profit, not-for-profit didn't look right to me. And that was kind of a side thing that irritated me. So anyway, I quickly narrowed in on literally the first 20 lines of the project. And I noticed something that was kind of strange about it. So this gets into the unique features of SAS, and I certainly won't bore your audience with all the details of this, but when you put two data sets together in SAS and you merge them, you might be merging them according to some key, like a patient identification variable. If it happens that there is some kind of like extraneous variable that is in both data sets, let's say age is in both data sets, and for whatever reason, age is written in years in one and it's in months in the other. Let's just say that as an example. What SAS will do is it will take data set 1 and data set 2 and merge them, but it will retain the values from data set 2 when it comes to keeping the values for that common variable. Okay, so anything that's in that variable age that's in data set 1 gets overwritten. Okay. And that's unique to SAS. And what's further unique to SAS is that there's no error message given in a log from the software that says you've got a common variable. Software is currently overwriting it from one data set to the next. So this is happening. Now, what happened in terms of precise problems in this little cohort construction is that there was a data set that documented the very first dialysis facility that a patient treated in. Okay, so basically their facility at dialysis initiation, and that's got a Medicare provider number, the 6-digit number for the Medicare, certification is there. When they merged to the waitlisting data set, the waitlisting data set also has Medicare provider numbers in it that correspond to the certification number of the hospital that the transplant program is in, the program that actually listed the patient. And so when they do this merge, what happened essentially is that information about the very first dialysis facility, part of it was overwritten by information from this transplant waitlist data set that's got the identities of the listing hospitals. And so that data comes in, it overwrites some of this facility information. And so now you've got this sort of ambiguous mix of Medicare provider numbers in your cohort file. And it represents an unclear mix of first dialysis facility as well as transplant listing hospital. And this is where that weird mix of for-profit versus not-for-profit comes into play. What are transplant programs? Almost without exception in this country, they're in hospitals that are not-for-profit. Tenet and community health and for-profit hospital chains don't operate transplant programs. So anytime that you bring in profit status of a Medicare provider number, and you contaminated your Medicare provider number with transplant hospitals, you're going to end up grabbing a bunch of not-for-profit data. Essentially, that's what's happening. And that's really the crux of the problem here. That single merge that contaminated the dialysis facility attribution has sort of unleashed this cascade of problems that come afterward.
So basically you overwrote a large number of facilities. You basically lost a bunch of data, and the data that you lost was mostly data from for-profit centers during this merge.
Yeah, I mean, the data that you've lost is essentially as, I mean, this is, remember, you're only going to overwrite things in your dialysis facility data if the patient actually was waitlisted, because that's where the overwriting data is coming from. So you're taking anybody who's waitlisted, their dialysis facility data is being obliterated by the transplant listing program.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And you know of this from SAS already, so it's pretty
Oh
easy
yeah,
for you to pick up.
definitely.
Okay, so
Yeah, I mean,
everyone.
it's a mistake I made when I was 22 or 23, and I was naive to the workings of SAS.
Hmm.
So I learned my lesson at a young age, not to screw around with merge statements in SAS.
How
And
does
for that,
one how does one how does one deal with that? How do you
well, I
merge
don't know.
if
People have different ways of doing it. So obviously, you can use SQL type coding in SAS, and SQL does generate errors in your log. So that's one way to safeguard yourself. SQL doesn't overwrite things when you've got a common variable. If you're doing sort of traditional data steps in SAS, my technique is just that I'm basically obsessive about the variables that are in the two data sets that I'm merging together. So I know exactly what's in the two, and I make sure that there are no common variable names other than the key that you're actually merging on. And that results in hundreds of extra lines of codes. I've got every data step listed with a key statement that lists every single variable in my data set. It's obsessive and overkill, but it does prevent the problem from happening.
so is again, why is this do you need a doctorate in epidemiology to be able to figure this out? Is the issue that
I don't think you need a doctorate. I think that you do need experience.
yeah,
The software is one thing, and I do think I surmise that one of the analysts on this project who wrote a great deal of the code for the project was an experienced user of R and Python. And I think that person, I don't know Python, I do program in R as well, but I think that person probably made some assumptions about merging data sets and how that functionality as it appears in other languages, whether it's SQL or R or Python, that it behaves the same as SAS. And of course, that's a mistaken assumption. So I think that was in play, but that's a technical issue. A software programmer should know that or
hmm.
not know it.
How
As
did
far as I
go
was just
ahead,
going to say, as far as the intuition, the transplant counts, the wait list counts. I mean, you don't need a doctorate, but you do need to have a good sense of what population level data are.
yeah.
And I don't know how easy that is to get other than through experience.
Yeah, so when you silo, we have a weird type of siloing that happens in research. I guess it's not weird, but it's just certainly in health service and outcomes and stuff. One of my soapbox things is that the folks that are generating a lot of research are somewhat removed from the clinical trenches, and
Hmm.
so and so you kind of almost need you almost need some of a little bit of clinical understanding. Of course, you're demonstrating that you
Hmm.
don't need to be a doctor to necessarily sort this out, and certainly a lot of different nephrologists, I'm sure read this paper in JAMA and kind of
Hmm.
nodded along without noticing it. So anyhow,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about how this changes? How did this change the initial paper? So eventually, the
Yeah.
researchers kind of went through the code themselves, and ultimately in April of this year, actually, retracted the original paper and replaced it with the paper with the new data. Can you talk about how the data changed and
Yeah.
how the
Well, and
conclusions may change?
yeah, and that timeline is an interesting thing too. I mean, to make it clear to the audience, my interactions with the author, the senior author of the paper, were over by mid-October. At this point, we had agreed on the error in the code, the fact that there's going to need to be some changes here. Obviously left it to her and her team as to how to
Mm.
proceed, but my involvement was over. So it gives you
Yeah.
a sense of how much time delay there is on the backside here, the invisible process of revising a paper, retracting a paper. I was totally in the dark and honestly had wondered, is JAMA going to make a move? How long is it going to take? So I was as surprised as anybody, other than a reporter who had suggested to me that there could be a there could be a retraction coming. So I maybe had a few days of a hint, but that was about it. Um, so yeah, the revised numbers come out, and they came out exactly as I expected, which is to say that the discrepancy in transplant and waitlisting outcomes between for-profit and not-for-profit facilities was attenuated. Now, if we're going to live and die by p-values, it was still a significant difference in terms of a lower rate. I would characterize it as, depending on the outcome, whether you're talking living donor transplants, deceased donor transplants, waitlisting, we're talking about 15% lower rates, plus or minus, depending on the endpoint, for-profit versus not-for-profit. And that 15% relative rate difference, that's largely in line with some of the existing literature. The one study I had mentioned that looked at waitlist registration a few years back, it was a much smaller study, but it was in that ballpark. I think it was a 13% lower
What was the
rate.
original difference that was seen?
For
Oh,
waitlisting, I think it was a 57% lower. If I recall, the right hazard ratio was 0.43. I may have the wrong number, but it was in that neighborhood of being
wow.
0.4 to
Wow.
0.45.
You had gotten, when you had done this, hazard ratios of 0.8 or something like that. So which was in line with what they ultimately reported. So
yeah, and in the interest of keeping everybody sort of on target and keeping the conversation focused during the review process, I said I don't agree necessarily with all the methodology that the study authors propose, but it's their study, right? And
yeah.
I'm not here to critique every detail of your study. We're here to fix an error. So I restricted myself to identifying the error, and then let's see what the numbers are. I would suggest to you that, I had done additional analyses. And one of the things that's kind of strange about this study, in my opinion, is that it actually attributes a patient's entire transplant outcome, waitlist outcome, to the very last dialysis facility on record that a patient's at. And, to make an analogy to like a pharmacoepi study, I'd say this. Imagine you did a study and you were looking at, let's take ACE inhibitors, ARBs, and heart failure, hospitalization. And you followed patients for years. Some patients reach the end of follow-up, and you ask at the last day administrative censoring, were they using an ACE inhibitor or an ARB? Yes or no? Okay. For everybody who got to hospitalization, you ask, were they using an ACE inhibitor or ARB on the date of admission? So that would be like back attributing the drug exposure to the very last day of follow-up. It's kind of weird when you say it like that, but that's exactly what they did here. And I think that it's a study design that introduces some problems with respect to time varying confounding potentially. I mean, keep in mind, a lot of dialysis patients shift facilities over time. And even if they stay in the same building for 14 years, that building could be bought by a different dialysis provider and the profit status could change. So, the exposure in this variable, or in this study, of profit status was very crudely handled. And actually, if you do some sensitivity analyses that I had done, where I changed the profit status indicator to the dialysis facility on record after 3 months of dialysis, as opposed to the last one on record, the associations actually attenuate even further compared to what you see in the retracted paper, where you're seeing hazard ratios. I was seeing hazard ratios of 0.95 instead of 0.85. And at that point, given some of the regional differences, particularly some of the idiosyncratic places that some of these small not-for-profit chains are in, like Northern California, et cetera, I'm not sure that 0.95 is something you can really credibly hang your hat on.
So fascinating. So that's how is that how you would do it if you were looking for a difference between for-profit and not-for-profit? You wouldn't take the last place that they were at, whether they're profit or non-profit. You would kind of look at them. I mean, you try to account for time spent.
I mean, when you think about the process here, right? And it is definitely a two-part thing. And you got to recognize this is a dialysis facility and all the armamentarium that comes with it. They don't control who gets listed, okay? They don't control how many organs are available. The only thing the dialysis facility can truly do is make sure that appropriate patients receive referrals to transplant programs for
Right.
waitlist workup. That's what they can control. And they can do a bad job at it, and they can be an obstacle. But many of them try to do a good job at it. You can't control your geography. You can't control how many transplant hospitals are in a 50-mile radius around you. So there's a lot of stuff that's outside the control of a dialysis facility. But, I would suggest that because there's so much waitlisting activity that should be happening in the first 1 to 2 years of dialysis, that if anything, if you're going to try and align this study with clinical reality, you should be front-loading exposure and saying most of what happens in terms of transplant outcomes ought to be the responsibility, I want to call it culpability or whatever. It should be the early dialysis providers, not the late ones.
Interesting. Have you this isn't an interest of yours per se in terms of showing, or is it? I mean, maybe it's kind of like a side interest of yours to kind of show that, hey, and you have and you clearly, I mean, you it's not that you don't have a bias. Your bias is that you work for a for-profit dialysis center. So
I did, right.
So with that, sorry, you did. So with that bias, I guess you're looking at it. You're looking at the data, a little more critically, and
that's fair.
And I guess your feeling is that, based on what you've done again, that it's unlikely that there's a significant difference between profit and not-for-profit. Have you published any of this, or?
No, not in this specific domain. I don't publish too much in transplant specifically. I think there's a few scattered papers in my past, but like I said, I'm mostly in dialysis. It is definitely something that I think I will work on in the future. I want to think about how to write a paper or a new analysis that actually has something to offer, as opposed to just, tweaking a few methodological details to this study and, battling over the magnitude of a hazard ratio. I don't think that necessarily gets us anywhere. I think that, the hypothesis that I raised early on about the integration of outpatient dialysis and transplant, I think that's something that is worthy of investigation. If the actual mechanism here is that when you integrate the dialysis side and the transplant side of ESKD, that you get better outcomes, I think that's a worthwhile message. And I also think that there is something to probably be said for looking at this association between for-profit and not-for-profit within geographic strata, as opposed to doing national analyses. Because I think that would provide a little bit better resolution. And I have a pretty strong suspicion from public use files and some of the other reporting that the government does in dialysis facilities, that this for-profit, not-for-profit contrast with respect to transplant outcomes is probably not one that's homogeneous across all the states of this country. I actually think that you're going to find states where there's a big difference, and you're going to find other states where there's no difference, or even the converse of what was in the paper.
Yeah, and the issue is that this is so incredibly important, because really policy, in terms of payment policy, there was a recent, the Trump administration had this executive order, and a lot of it was focused on kind of quality within dialysis, right? It's this idea that you don't want to just pay per dialysis session or whatnot. You want to pay for outcomes, and one of those outcomes is getting people off of dialysis and getting them a kidney transplant, right?
Right.
And so, and a lot of, this is the type of research that may shape payment initiatives. And so, it's really important to get this right. Are there groups that have published things to suggest that there isn't much of a difference? There isn't much of a significant difference here, or that?
Yeah, well, so in my CV, you can find a paper that I was the middle author on back in like 2008 or 2009 that looked at mortality, actually death rates, in for-profit versus not-for-profit facilities. This was using old data, from around the turn of the century. I believe that we had found maybe a 8% lower rate of mortality in not-for-profit facilities back then. And I know that I've got a good friend who's a nephrologist, epidemiologist, and when she was at UC Davis, she had done some work with looking at hospitalization and readmission rates, and seeing a small association also favoring not-for-profit units. So there is quite a bit of literature that I would say, it's observational, but it consistently shows modestly better outcomes in not-for-profit units. Um, I myself am pretty torn on this one, to be honest with you. You see all of these studies that pile up, but the associations tend to be pretty modest in magnitude. And given some of the potential for geographic confounding, I definitely have my worries that we're seeing geography more than anything else. I know there's a temptation to think, all these people are on dialysis, they're in pretty poor conditions. But guess what? Dialysis patient outcomes vary geographically too. and dialysis patients in California have very different hospitalization rates than ones in the Ohio River Valley.
Do you think that's because of the patients, or that's just because of why is that?
Oh, I think it could be any number of things, from the patients to the broader economic and environmental conditions, healthcare delivery systems, et cetera. I mean, when you think about things like bloodstream infections and vascular access infections, I mean, those aren't so much reflection of cannulation practices or antibiotic administration policies that vary from one place to the country. So it's hard for me to believe that it can be readily explained with just case mix. I suspect that there are genuine practice patterns, and then there's the socioeconomic complications that drive some of it, a lot of it, actually.
Yeah. Do you think, what do you think the role of bias is here? We hear all the time about bias being the most important bias being financial.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there's a big component of a lot of these papers in terms of how credible they are that derives from the fact that somebody can say no financial conflicts of interest are noted here. Now, if you wrote a paper, I guess now it's okay, but if you wrote a paper anytime within the last decade or so, you would not be able to generate unconflicted research. And
sure.
if you listen to some of the big names or the influencers, they would automatically, before even reading your paper, discount this because, hey, this is coming from these from some private group. What are your thoughts on bias and its role here?
Yeah, I find it pretty difficult to tease that out. Actually, so I mean, everybody's got different perspectives on things, and definitely, I have worked on a registry, in a safety net hospital. I've worked in a device manufacturer that was a publicly traded company. It never did generate a profit in its 17 years of existence, but it got close. So I was there, and then, for the last year, I worked at, the largest manufacturer of dialysis products and services around in the whole world. So I'd like to say I've seen it from different facets. I think that's what drives a lot of my own confusion about these murky labels like profit status and financial arrangements, because I don't see consistent patterns of behavior from one place to the next. What I do see is what I see is a disease state that is expensive. Dialysis, chronic dialysis, no matter which way you cut it, you're dealing with significant amount of comorbidity. And, if a patient isn't dialyzing at home, you've got to deal with all of the capital expenses and the labor expenses that go with delivering in-center dialysis. It's expensive, and there are hospitalizations involved, and there are vascular access complications and infections, et cetera. And the government, CMS is a huge player in terms of financing dialysis delivery and providing Medicare coverage. And that's a laudable program to the extent that, once upon a time in this country, that didn't even exist. And we had to choose who would receive dialysis or not, dating back to the 1960s and 1970s. But at the same time, when you look at, since Medicare started a bundled payment rate for dialysis in 2011, that really has ushered in a period in which the per treatment reimbursement rate for outpatient dialysis has inflated very, very slowly relative to healthcare expenditures. So, I think that it's difficult for me to fully think through how some of these financial forces influence care and the nature of care delivery in some of these flippant ways that people sometimes think about it, because I think it's pretty complicated. On the academic publishing side, I think people do have biases. They personal and political biases into scientific studies, and I tend to actually diminish the notion of people exhibiting like grant seeking and fame seeking behavior. Maybe some people do that, but I tend not to put a lot of stock in that. I worry more about personal and political biases that allow you to confirm things that match how you vote and how you think about the world.
So fascinating. It's very hard to escape politics. So this idea that we can somehow, the science stands on its own without any political front. And and again, not to specifically pick out JAMA, though I am picking out JAMA. JAMA has definitely over the last few years certainly made itself. Part of its brand is the idea that we're going to show you that a for-profit health system is bad, and here's the data to show you that it's bad. And I think everyone would be foolish and naive to think that isn't done with a purpose. There isn't a political purpose to doing that. So no, definitely. But I mean, it's an amazing. The whole story is amazing, and thank God. You kind of looked at it and had the interest and kind of looked further and kind of untangled the story. But the bigger issue is that there's lots and lots of these. I'm sure there's lots and lots of these stories that are playing out that we just aren't aware of.
Funny you should mention that. Yeah. There are papers that are worth having a public debate about, and others that I don't think are really all that worthwhile to even tangle over, even if they are published in a high-profile journal. So, speak of the devil, JAMA published a research letter about a month ago, and I don't know if many people read it in the midst of our pandemic. I can't imagine it attracted a lot of attention, but it looked at changes in Medicare coverage as a percentage of all dialysis patients over the last 10 or 12 years. And it looked specifically, there's two figures in this little research letter, and one of them segments dialysis facilities into for-profit and not-for-profit status. And sure enough, for-profit dialysis facilities appear to be avoiding Medicare-covered patients and trying to accumulate more privately commercially insured patients compared to their not-for-profit counterparts. By the end of the study period, 2015-16, I think this figure shows that something like 60 to 65% of people have Medicare coverage. Now, I looked at that figure and I thought, well, that's kind of weird. Depends how you define it. So,
wait, Eric, I'm sorry. Explain this to me again. So, sorry. Yeah. They're looking at patients that are on dialysis. They're looking at dialysis patients.
They're looking at dialysis patients and basically asking, of all dialysis patients, what percentage of them have Medicare coverage?
Oh, okay.
Because Medicare coverage pays.
Yeah, I thought that's what was confusing me. I thought all dialysis is once you're in dialysis, you're Medicare. That's not true?
No. So if you come in with commercial insurance, you can keep that, and there is a coordination period. So basically the way it works is that your commercial insurance will remain a primary payer for a 33-month coordination period. And basically at the end of 3 years of dialysis, at that point, Medicare switches into the primary position.
Did not know that. Okay.
Takes second. Yeah. In addition, so that's existed for many years, but in addition, there has been a rotation from fee-for-service to Medicare Advantage in the dialysis population, just like in the general population. And so that piece is swelling too. So I looked at this research letter, which seems to suggest that by 2015 or 16, 17, I don't know which year it was, we're down to like 60% of the population as Medicare. I thought, well, only if you're counting fee-for-service people, that would be true. However, the instrument that they used, which is a data piece in this USRDS registry, was something called the Annual Facility Survey. That's a survey that's done of every dialysis facility in the country at the end of the year. December 31st, you count your patients up and you say, are they Medicare or not? The rules for that single instrument say when you're counting Medicare people, you count people who are entitled. That means fee-for-service. It means Medicare Advantage. It also means MSP, Medicare as secondary pay. You put all those people in. If you count that number, you'd get 80%. Now, the authors of this research letter, I've already checked the data. they did everything right. The instrument itself is completely flawed. I don't know when it broke down. I have my suspicions that it broke down when the government went from paper form to electronic form for this survey and people stopped reading the instructions. But the research letter is garbage because the data itself are flawed. The authors didn't know it. The reviewers didn't notice it. I'm not going to deal with it. I've had my experience with JAMA. But, this stuff piles up all over the place.
Wow. Wow. So there are, you're saying there 80% of, I'm sorry, you're just much more knowledgeable about this stuff. To
No,
you,
it's
it's like a different language. 80% of folks are on are Medicare.
80% of dialysis patients have Medicare in some form or another participating in finance of care. And that could be through Parts A and B, traditional fee-for-service. It could be Advantage, or it could just be that Medicare is a secondary payer behind somebody else.
But if Medicare is a secondary payer, so I see. So Medicare is a secondary payer behind somebody else. So it could be like Medicaid primary, and then Medicaid is a secondary
Medicaid
payer?
is never primary.
Okay, so Medicare, then Medicaid. So
Yeah.
then, so commercial as a primary payer with
Right.
Medicare as a secondary payer is,
Exactly.
and some portion of that is commercial only, though. I mean,
Yes,
commercial
there
is
is
paid
some
for
of that too.
and that happens in that first 33 months if you come in as a commercial payer. Then you are the
Right.
commercial payers are the primary payers. So you're saying that
Yeah.
that is normally, and you kind of know this because you know this stuff, it's normally 20%. And
well, it's actually less than 20%, just because you do have an uninsured group.
Right.
You also have a Medicaid only share within
Okay.
there, and then you have people who have VA and TRICARE.
I see. So it's some small percentage, but
Yeah.
but this research letter says that the folks that have Medicare paying some part of their dialysis is 60%.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a huge discrepancy.
Mm-hmm.
And just for my edification, what did they conclude based on that? They concluded that,
well, like I said, there are two figures in this research letter, and the second figure in the letter actually stratifies all the dialysis facilities into this same old for-profit versus not-for-profit. And there they show a discrepancy where the Medicare share appears to be lower in the for-profit units. Remember, with the nature dialysis is and contracting rates between dialysis providers and commercial insurers, DaVita and Fresenius both discussed this in their investor calls. You've got a big chunk of your revenue that comes from commercially insured patients. And so, this research letter would seem to support the hypothesis that there's some sort of gaming, that for-profit units are accumulating these commercially insured lives in an attempt to sort of gin up extra revenue.
I see.
Attractive hypothesis, but the data itself are flawed.
Yeah. How do they go? How would they go about doing that? I mean, how does Fresenius and DaVita go about trying to get commercial?
Well, I'm just an epidemiologist, so I don't have a lot of experience with all of the mechanisms that are used to actually interact with patients as consumers. But that is an element. You're trying to attract patients to your dialysis facility and make sure that they're happy and well taken care of. And so, there can be all sorts of things that can attract a person to a dialysis facility, from the environment to what shift of the day you dialyze in,
Sure. But what's wrong with it? Or what am I missing here? Like, who cares if DaVita and Fresenius are better at getting commercial? I mean, again, we're making this arbitrary line between profit and not-for-profit. And, from where I sit, it's not like the large non-for-profit health systems are somehow the saviors of the health system. From where I sit, they're inflicting their own pretty special brand of damage on the system in a variety of different ways. But basically, it's a letter that says that, hey, look, they may be acquiring a bigger proportion of folks that are commercial, and just implying that that's bad for some reason. But clearly, just you looking at the figures, it seems like whatever data analysis they're doing is probably garbage, because they're off by such a massive number just looking at the underlying rates.
It's a curious choice. It goes back a little bit to, again, understand your data. They use this sort of weird instrument called the annual facility survey. sitting right there in the USRDS registry as the master beneficiary file for Medicare. It's literally the enrollment database that says month by month, are you in Medicare or not? There is an unambiguous record sitting right there in that data set that tells you whether you're Medicare. Now, you don't need to use this strange survey from, that was designed for use a generation ago. So you get, researchers make a curious choice. They don't know what they're analyzing, and you generate a research letter that sounds good, but is crazy.
Wow.
It's all a very avoidable error, but it keeps happening.
It kind of sounds like giving the keys to like a Ferrari to like a 12-year-old and saying, all right, go drive down, the Schuylkill in Philly, and bad things are going to happen. But all right, this has been I've taken up a lot of your time. Let's see, is there anything else that I wanted to make sure that I hit since we have you? This has been really, really, really great. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for doing this. After in the late hours after you put your kids to bed.
That's okay. Well, hey, I would. Go ahead.
I did really want to ask you. Home dialysis.
Oh yeah.
We did this podcast with Joel Top about I don't know if you saw that. I came out of that interview. Again, I don't know much about dialysis and incentives and all that stuff. It's not a world I live in all the time. But I came out of that podcast with this feeling that part of the reason we don't have more options for patients in terms of home dialysis has a lot to do with the incentives that currently exist in our system. So it almost felt like we did a great thing, seemingly, by saying as a society that we will not let you. We will be some backstop financially for anyone that goes on dialysis. So have insurance, no insurance, uninsured. We will somehow, as a society, say you're not gonna go without getting dialysis. And so we introduced a system where we pay, Medicare covers dialysis regardless of how, what age you are and whatnot. But I came away from that discussion with Joel with the idea that perhaps we would have a lot more dialysis options for patients if we had a different structure. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, I must admit that over time, I have become less enamored with the levers that Medicare can pull to drive modality utilization in this country, with respect to home versus in-center, or with respect to either of the modalities at home. I think that there's room for that, but I also think that we've got a number of examples, including a pretty adventurous bundled payment system that was introduced in 2011 that was designed definitely with the purpose of encouraging peritoneal dialysis that moved the needle, but it moved the needle by a few percentage points. It didn't change the world. And unfortunately, it was undercut completely for unrelated reasons in 2014 by a peritoneal dialysis fluid shortage that really cut the legs off the momentum. That was due to manufacturing problems that occurred internationally. So that kind of slowed things down. This executive order that was released last year quickly generated a proposed rule for a brand new payment model in the form of a giant randomized trial to encourage home dialysis. That is still sitting. My understanding is that that's a final rule sitting at OMB awaiting review, but no one knows when it might hit the register at some point. If it does this year, next year, who knows? So I don't know. I do think this, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about home hemodialysis in particular. I think it's fair to say that I probably have a bias toward it for some clinical reasons, but patients are anxious and nervous and pretty scared, late-stage chronic kidney disease, and particularly when it's time to create a vascular access or initiate dialysis. And, there's a lot of education that needs to happen, thoughtful education that needs to happen to encourage home dialysis. And honestly, I think a lot of it, in my opinion, starts and stops with the nephrologist. It's easy to push all of this onto Medicare and say, oh, you guys didn't create the right incentives, you don't have the right levers. But there's only one class of professionals in the nephrology space that writes the prescription for dialysis, and that is the physicians themselves. Now, we can get into whether the financial incentives are appropriate for them, and I think that there's bona fide arguments there of misalignments with RVUs and different reimbursement rates for home versus in-center dialysis, et cetera, as it's paid to the physician rather than to the dialysis facility. But I think that one of the problems that we have, and Joel could talk to it much better than I could, any nephrologist could, because they go through the education system, is that a lot of fellows in nephrology don't get exposure to home dialysis at all in training. They have minimal exposure to dialysis compared to the many pathologies of kidney disease. And so, when you put them then in practice and you're trying to communicate with the patient and their family member that it's time to start dialysis, if the patient and family member perceives that you don't know what you're talking about with respect to home dialysis, that conversation is dead on arrival. I've been in the office and watched this conversation play out many times, and it doesn't go well. No patient wants to take on a home dialytic modality that their physician or nurse doesn't seem to understand. And so I think that that's a real challenge that we still have to overcome. Now, with respect to the home dialysis modalities, I will say that on a personal level, I'm frustrated by the fact that we have a lot of ambivalence about the efficacy arguments around home dialysis modalities. Now, peritoneal dialysis is a very different animal than home hemodialysis, and there's debates to be had with each of them. On the home hemo side, the thing that I argue about and have written plenty about is frequency of dialysis. Everybody in center is dialyzing 3 times a week. There are a bunch of studies that show that long gap that happens between the end of one week and the beginning of the next, if you dialyze Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you've got Saturday and Sunday without dialysis. Strange, crazy things happening with electrolytes and heart rhythms and lots of bradycardia. Loop recorder studies have shown this. On Sunday night, the heart is just overloaded at that point. This volume issue, all of the volume and cardiac issues that go with 3 times a week dialysis, in my opinion, are pretty significant. And yet, in the face of a lot of observational studies, a few randomized trials, and a ton of international experience with nocturnal dialysis and other regimens that are designed to increase frequency and dialysis hours per week, we still have a lot of reticence and a lot of skepticism that increasing dialysis intensity does anything good for people. And yet, the thing that sold me on the therapy was getting to know patients and listening to these stories and these transformations that people experience going from 3 times a week therapy to longer therapy regimens, whether that was daytime or overnight. And for me, seeing is believing. It goes as powerful as any observational study that you can construct. And
that's fascinating. So you're saying, as a epidemiologist, math guy, big data man, I mean, you're saying that the most powerful thing that's kind of shifted you and moved your priors has really been talking to patients.
Yep.
Am I saying, getting that accurate?
That's right. And home dialysis is hard work. It's no surprise. See, the thing is, there's always a counterpoint to this. Dialysis is still a precarious state, right? You're one episode away from too much fluid and your heart stops. Sudden cardiac death is the leading cause of death. So this is a challenging disease state, and there's plenty of opportunities for things to go wrong. Patients discontinue home dialysis frequently and return back to the in-center environment. So if you think that you're going to design an observational study with an intention to treat principle and show some great benefit of home dialysis, you're kidding yourself. It's not, the world's too messy to show those kinds of effects. I think the important thing that you need to recognize, or we should aim for, is how do we design studies, particularly observational ones, because randomized trials are few and far between dialysis, that give opportunities to inform patients and nephrologists about, given this clinical circumstance, this is your set of comorbidities, this is your volume cardiac profile right now, what would be the best modality for you for the foreseeable future? That's not to say it's going to be the modality for the rest of your life. We have to become comfortable, I think, with the notion that changing modalities periodically is perfectly normal. We call it technique failure, in the scientific parlance, but it's not a failure at all. It's transitions, and transitions happen in life. And that's okay. We should encourage smooth transitions between dialysis modalities. But again, it drives me crazy that I and a small cartel of people like me face such an uphill battle trying to make the argument for increasing dialysis intensity, because I think that the argument is pretty compelling. And especially if you look at this from a cardiovascular perspective.
Fascinating. So, and to be clear, patients just feel, you think in your conversations with patients feel better and
Yeah, so there's one outcome in dialysis that has been studied a fair bit, and it's called post-dialysis recovery time. And basically, it comes in the form of a question. It's not a feeling thermometer, though you can do that too. But the question is, at the end of dialysis, you ask a person, about how many hours was it before you felt like yourself again? And, you have to remember, for an incident patient, they've dialyzed for 3.5, 3 hours, 45 minutes, let's say. They've ultra filtered multiple liters off during that period of time. They're pretty washed out, or can be. They may have had hypotensive episodes during treatment. And so they're feeling pretty crappy, nausea, dizziness, etc. And for some patients, it can be a good 6 hours. It can be a whole overnight before they feel better again. Um, the patients who began dialyzing more frequently, especially on nocturnal schedules, talk about recovery times in minutes. It's literally disconnecting from the machine and feeling fine within 10 to 30 minutes. And that to me is one of the most striking, and it's a rapid effect. It isn't something like it takes 3 to 6 months before patients realize this. They're reporting it after 1 to 2 weeks. So
fascinating. So, yeah, we should definitely cycle around and do another conversation about this, and maybe bring in one of the
sure.
clinical nephrologists too. That'd be really
Yeah,
interesting.
that'd be great.
So I have to ask.
I can find a few skeptics too to counter my enthusiasm.
No, absolutely. No, this is a good conversation because and I'm sure this has been happening in the nephrology community for a while.
Yeah.
So me as a cardiac guy, I kind of am vaguely aware that these conversations happen. I don't kind of do much more than dip a toe in every now and then. So sure. I have to ask, since we're talking about big data and epidemiology, there's been no time in probably the last 100 years, or I don't know, maybe no time in history, because I don't think there were this many epidemiologists around in the 1900s. But no time in history where there's been as much hubbub about epidemiologists and how important they are in terms of the current pandemic we're in. Your thoughts on how epidemiology has been doing? And
yeah, it's an interesting thing. I'm definitely, dialysis has an infectious disease component to be sure, but by no stretch of the imagination, I'm an ID epi guy. So, I sort of observe everything that's going on in the public discourse with as much wonder and amazement as anyone else does. Yeah. And I'm not above making a few amateur figures with Minnesota data. So I just play the game too. It's an interesting thing. I think that epi has had an opportunity to shine. It's also, I think, been exposed for some of its flaws in terms of reliance on mathematical models and sometimes making predictions that don't necessarily bear out. Epi programs, in particular, doctoral epi programs, come in a lot of different flavors around this country. Now, I went to the University of Minnesota, which, has literally the division. It's called Division of Epidemiology and Community Health. And it is very much a public health oriented program. A lot of alcohol, tobacco, obesity kinds of main public health issues. Clinical epi is really a sidelight of the program. There is a cardiovascular component in the field, but there was nobody in the program that was doing nephrology or dialysis. My training in the field came from the hospital rather than the epi program. And there are other programs in this country, particularly at big institutions, really high profile ones like Harvard, Boston University, et cetera, that have really strong quantitative components. I would suggest to you that most of my classmates from my epi program weren't great at statistical methods by the time they were done. They were learning SAS for the first time by second year, third year of their program. I came in with a biostat degree, so it was a little different animal because I've already got training on the quantitative stuff. Epi without biostat is, in my opinion, a dangerous game. And we've got a lot of epidemiologists who are not necessarily great at quantitative stuff. And I think that is a problem, but that's my opinion. I've got a bias that favors the quantitative side of it. And I think that problem is magnified when you have big data sets and the need for complex modeling, especially when you get into clinical topics and you've got to deal with really challenging confounding problems and selection bias problems. You really got to know your math chops to be able to get through this stuff and unwind the data well. But yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
It's a little bit of a loaded question, but you're describing for the fact that even folks that have I don't think you're describing what you've described in the first hour of our conversation. You're not describing a problem with math or statistics per se, right?
No, no.
You're describing, and where you're almost talking about is that, you know, it's a solution that doesn't come from just crunching
Hmm.
crunching numbers. It's not a quantitative problem to solve. Is
Right.
I mean, is that the same? Do you get the sense that that's the same thing when we're talking about models for the pandemic? Are you comfortable? I know you're not an ID
Yeah.
epidemiologist, but with what you know about epidemiology, and you've got a tremendous amount of quantitative experience, do you feel like where epidemiology is at the stage as a science to be making massive decisions on whether 300 million people should be locked down, and for what duration of time should they lock down? What's the confidence with which people should
Yeah.
be kind of relying on that? I mean, is epi, in terms of doing what it's been doing, too big for its britches?
My gut feeling is yes. In the context of this pandemic, I think that there is an analog to the topic we've been discussing for this whole time, which is the quality of the data and understanding the data. And the challenge I think that we have with COVID-19 is that the data that we have is not so good. In terms of understanding who got
Yeah.
tested, what percentage of uh, the selection bias that goes into the testing is by far the biggest issue. And then we've got the properties of the test that can perturb your understanding of what a positive test rate means. But we have denominators all over the place that are completely unclear here. And I think that really complicates all of the analyses. I mean, you can look at these models from one of two perspectives. Anybody can build a model that's akin to a simulation, right? Put together a lot of formulas with some differential equations and create a model that forecasts something. Or you can model observed data and then make a forecast from it. It's not sometimes clear to me what we're doing in the course of this pandemic. The line has blurred between those two approaches to such a degree that I feel like, with the IH&E model in its early stages, it was taking the first 7 days or the first 10 days of the epidemic playing out in a state in this country and then making a projection for 6 months. I mean, that's sort of like doing a linear regression over, well, literally make the same analogy over 6 months, but you only have observed data from the first 10 days. I mean, yeah,
So why
it's out there.
isn't that uncertainty impregnated into what they're saying? When I have conversations with
Mhm.
patients about what to do in terms of, like, I had a conversation today with a family. I should be careful here. It involves a patient with who had a cardiac arrest, who survived a
Mhm.
cardiac arrest, and it's unclear what exactly happened. I don't
Mhm.
have, the patient didn't have a device implanted for me to know what the initial rhythm was.
Yeah.
EMS got there. There were shocks administered. We don't exactly know what the heck happened initially. And I'm very frank with the family, saying, like, I'm not exactly sure what to do here, but we're going to try to make, or I'm trying to make a decision based on X, Y, and Z. But
Mhm.
there's a lot of uncertainty here, and I feel like I try to do that a lot because there is so much uncertainty impregnated into so many of the decisions we
Mhm.
make. Um, but that's partly where I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not, I haven't done, I don't have a quantitative background, certainly like many epi folks like you do, or other folks
Sure.
do. But there's this intuitive sense from doing medicine that there's got to be a ton of uncertainty here, and here it feels like the idea is to minimize the amount of uncertainty there is
Mhm.
in a lot of the modeling that happens, so we can get people to buy in. And
Yeah.
it's like the exact opposite of what I try to do most of the time. I'm not
Mhm.
trying to just tell the patient and the family in front of me that this is exactly what you must do, because that's what the data points to. What I'm trying to say is that, this is very uncertain. There are different paths that we can take depending
Mhm.
on what your risk threshold are, and understanding that each one of these things that we do, we can do more aggressive things, but the more aggressive things that we do, they're higher risk to the patient. And so, you know, how do we want to, you know, this is what I need your help in terms of telling me what your threshold for risk is, etc. But understand, if we do this, you know, if we take a conservative approach, you know, there is the chance that 2-3 years from now you come back with worse disease, blah blah blah. If we take an aggressive approach, there's less of a chance you may come back later on, but we buy an upfront risk of X, Y, and Z. You know, so it's this constant, very difficult conversation we have about these trade-offs that folks are making, and it's very rare that we have these perfect times. You know, sometimes we have perfect information. Really, I mean, patient has an implanted device. Just I keep going back to this because implanted device, you see a cardiac arrhythmia happen right away, and my God, like, okay, there's, I mean, this is, you know, there's no doubt about what you're telling people.
Sure.
But a lot of times, you know, their decisions are not that clear because we don't have perfect information, and it really feels that uncertainty conversation isn't happening. Is that, well, why is that?
I agree with that. I mean, I can more facilely discuss this in the context of the sort of work I do, but you know, you routinely see these observational studies. I propagate them too. You write them up. You did a model. You did a few sensitivity analyses. Things look like they're pretty similar, but then you got this limitations paragraph lurking in the discussion, and it talks about, oh, I got some unmeasured confounders, and there's some misclassification bias, information error of various sources, but you don't attempt to quantify any of it. Now, there have been people in the epi field who have encouraged that there be more of this uncertainty analysis that's done, but it simply hasn't ever reached the clinical journals. And so we have mollified ourselves into being okay with 95% confidence intervals. We stop at stochastic error. And I have the suspicion that part of the reason why we stop there is because if we also layered on all of the information error, the potential uncertainty that comes from that, it would obliterate every confidence interval under the sun. And you'd be left with observational studies that have relative rates that have true uncertainty interval endpoints that go from 0.5 up to 5, and it would be routine. And people would say, this is ridiculous. So there is a certain degree of me that's like, well, we're trying to comfort ourselves by sort of packaging some of these problems in text rather than numbers.
Yeah. Well said. All right, Eric, I have taken up way too much of your time. I really appreciate it. It was really a fascinating conversation. We usually go for an hour, but this was just too good, and you have too much information that we can plumb. So it was really great. All right, let me.
Pleasure.
So thanks again, and
You're welcome.
we shall chat soon. All right.
All right.
Oh, before
Have
I go,
yes.
before I go, I should tell me what's your handle on Twitter?
It's Eric, ERIC _ Winehandl, WEINHANDL.
Excellent. All right. Awesome.